All of us do some form of dissociation to some degree. A lot of times if somebody's driving, they may have highway hypnosis. They're driving along, they lose a little space and time, they kind of daydream. Next thing they know, they're down the road and they don't really remember how they got there.
Dissociation looks different in every client. Sometimes I'll see people that zone out, for lack of a better word.
It's a way for people to escape from the current trauma that they're in and go to a different place.
It can take on different forms, where if it's a little bit more severe, you may see a client who experiences their consciousness across the room, and they can actually see themselves sitting on that couch, or see themselves sitting in a chair but not feel connected to their body.
My name is Celeste Bailey, and I am a senior at Reedy High School in Frisco, Texas. I have consulted several professionals from the broad field of psychology in order to delve deeper into the phenomenon of dissociation.
I got into mental health really early on. I majored in psychology in undergrad and knew I wanted to pursue learning about relationships and families. My family background is in healthcare.
I got into the field of mental health after I had been a journalist, and I was also a teacher in public schools for 7 years, and I decided I can't do the teaching for the rest of my life, and I really love my kids. I taught 8th graders, and I wanted to go back to school and get my master's in counseling. So I did, but I realized I wouldn't get to counsel all the time in the public schools like I wanted to. So I decided I would go into private practice, and I'm so glad I did.
Original goal was to start working in the research aspect of the field. So, gathering statistical research, helping write papers, do journal publishing, that type of thing. As I started through that research process, I realized I was a lot more interested in the human connection aspect of it and actually working with people on a face-to-face basis.
I was in college, and it was probably about my last year. And I was a TA for one of the professors, and she also ended up being a mentor of mine. And I participated in a research study she was doing with elementary age kids.
Back when I was in college, I had a friend that was going through a tough time, and I felt like I needed to help her to find resources to help her along with what she was going through, that and offering support. It kind of dovetailed with me taking a general psychology class in college, and those sort of seemed to, those two events seemed to just make me think that mental health was something that I'd like to pursue.
One significant example of a very interesting mental health behavior is dissociation. Dissociation is when a person, quite literally, subconsciously loses the association they have with either their past self or their present self.
When it comes to dissociation, it's a defense mechanism that the brain comes up with in order to deal with the emotional reactivity that a trauma creates.
Dissociative disorders, there are a number of them. The most common ones that we look at as being dissociative disorders would be something like depersonalization, derealization as a complex manifestation of dissociative disorders. Sometimes we talk about like what used to be multiple personality disorder. It's now categorized as dissociative identity disorder. There's also like psychogenic fugue.
For my training, dissociative disorders are caused from severe trauma.
Their brain comes up with a way to not feel it by separating itself.
Such trauma is occurring not far from home. Under current U.S. law, children of families immigrating from Mexico to the United States are being forcibly separated from their parents.
What we're doing to families on the border and what we're doing to children on the border is that we're removing children from their families, from their primary caretakers, with no explanation, no thought of reunification.
When it comes to children connected to their parents or being separated from their parents, parents are supposed to be the safety factor for a child. They're supposed to be that concrete anchor that they can come back to when they feel threatened. If a child is forcibly removed from their parents, if there is some sort of trauma connected to that, or it happens in a traumatic way, that can have a pretty lasting effect on a person well into adulthood.
We see a lot of reactivity and a lot of difficulty forming close attachments with their parents because of A, the distance, and A, how that trauma has affected them without the parent not being present, and how their family life kind of jumps around quite a bit with who they're living with or where they're staying or the consistency of their parents' jobs and their financial income, and their ability to provide for all their needs for their kiddos.
These children, prior to even getting to the border, are being abducted from their family, being separated from their family have gone through a whirlwind of trauma. Their life, from what I can imagine, coming from a country that is rich in violence and poverty, has been very challenging for them since they were in utero. And you take into consideration their parents' traumas, even a mother being pregnant with a child trying to survive. That child can, research has shown that the child can actually sense that mother's stress. You know, children, once they get to a certain age in the womb, can kind of become aware of what goes on outside of their home.
Attachment's a crucial developmental milestone for most children. We look at attachment mainly in the first few years of life and figure if a child is attached, that gives them sort of something that will help them moving forward to have resiliency and be able to manage stressors. If there's a severing of that attachment in those first few years of life, it leads to instability. It makes a child maybe struggle more in terms of being able to understand empathy and to feel that resiliency, and so it can cause psychological impacts later on. Additionally, we say that not just 2 years, but in the first 5 years of life, that can be important to kind of look at. In terms of that separation at the U.S. border and reviewing what APA, American Psychological Association, has put out, some of the things they talk about as being traumatic are that it's not just the border and what all a child may be going through or a person may be going through there, but we have to think about all the things that go into that. Like maybe there was something traumatic before they ever got here. Many of the individuals that are going to the border may have been fleeing an unsafe situation. There may be language barriers that then feel difficult for them to overcome, and that can feel traumatic. Unstable housing, transitions where they may not be with caregivers, all those things weigh in and can compound what is perceived as a trauma.
From what I'm understanding is that there has been a lot of sexual abuse that has happened while these children are under the care of our government. I am beyond appalled, sickened by that statement. First of all, that we've removed children from families, and then you add in that layer of these children have been sexually abused also. To me, that is setting up, lifelong problems for these kids.
There's a lot of trauma that happens to this child very early on in their development. The first 5 years are the most critical for attachment. And so I'm sure the parents are doing, or the caretakers are doing everything they can just to survive, and that they live in a state of just survival. So they're in fight or flight all the time.
You don't get over that. You don't get over the trauma of being separated. You don't get over the trauma of being sexually abused. You don't get over the trauma of being put in a cage, deprived of your basic needs. These kids aren't being held and loved, which we know is incredibly important for bonding, for attachment, for just our development, our brain's development. It's simply appalling what we're doing.
The trauma is definitely going to be big. They're going to have a really tough time, and then that's when you bring in dissociative disorders, because that's a way to escape. You got to go somewhere, someplace safe in your head to escape all of the reality of the dangers around you.
We haven't kept families together once they've crossed over. That would have been the common decent thing to do, is keep the family unit together. And I hear, well, we didn't know if they were families. Well, there's just a whole lot wrong with what's been happening. I'm really frightened for what is going to happen to these kids long term.
The type of trauma occurring at the US-Mexico border is definitely incredibly severe. However, there are many other types of trauma that are much more common among the general population.
I work with pretty much only families and couples, and so a lot of kiddos I work with have experienced some form of trauma, and so can be physical, sexual, emotional, different types of abuse or neglect. And I utilize a lot of what's called trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy in order to help kids find ways to cope and get through some of the triggers and symptoms they have, and also find security in the people that are taking care of them and feel safe within themselves. And so it's a big part of my work, I think. hugely because of the relationship piece that I focus on with both parents or whoever is the caregiver, really, and making sure they do feel safe and secure and close.
I have worked with clients that have what I consider mild cases of DID, meaning that they're not full DID, meaning that they are aware that they have these different personalities that come out as defense mechanisms to kind of help them cope with whatever is disturbing them. So kind of like if you can imagine being a teacher and a mom or dad and a softball coach and maybe a guidance counselor or something in your church. So you have to put on different hats to deal with those different roles in your world. Well, obviously that's a little bit more of a healthier way of dealing. That's probably somebody who's a little bit more balanced in their world, and so they're aware of the different hats they put on consciously. In DID, and even individuals who present with mild cases of DID, sometimes they're not always in control of those personalities that come out. But in the cases that I've actually worked with, they are aware of it because they tell me about it, or they're like, see, now I'm mad, and now I want to, if they have the tools to say what they want to do, now I just want to go and hit that pillow right now because I don't know how to handle this.
One of the things that we utilize when it comes to trauma therapy the most is EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy. This is something I use with pretty much all of my trauma clients in some way or another. And essentially the way EMDR works through the rapid eye movement or lighting up both sides of the brain to help digest the memories. I'll explain it in the best way I had it explained to me. EMDR helps the brain digest traumatic memories the same way the body digests food. So if you think about how we eat food, we take in those nutrients, our body pulls what it needs from that food, and it gets rid of the rest. If you think to what you had for breakfast 3 weeks ago, you probably can't remember exactly what it was or what you were wearing that day or anything else connected to that because it wasn't a traumatic memory. So your brain took the information it needed from that and it forgot the rest. When you get food poisoning, your body can't pull the nutrients from that food the same way, so the food sits there until we get sick. Traumatic memories essentially affect the brain the same way food poisoning affects our body. Our brain knows the information was relevant, it knows it was difficult, it knows that there were a lot of high emotions connected to it, but it doesn't know how to digest the information. So the brain holds that traumatic memory and it retains the same level of emotional reactivity and the same responses that it did from day one when that trauma happened. So that's why we can remember those really difficult memories really vividly versus not remembering what we had for breakfast 3 weeks ago. So essentially where EMDR helps is it helps the brain digest those traumatic memories so we're not having the same level of emotional reactivity to them. We can look back at that traumatic memory after going through EMDR and say, yeah, that was really hard and it really sucked, but I'm not going to have that same emotional reactivity to it. I'm not seeing it as vividly. So that's why EMDR is incredibly helpful when it comes to trauma processing and trauma therapy because it does help take down that emotional reactivity.
Oftentimes I find people want to minimize the trauma they've been and they discount it and say, well, it's not as bad as so-and-so, and I feel guilty about having talked about my trauma because it's not as bad as this. But yes, I've walked with all kinds of trauma.
Psychological trauma can be devastating and incredibly life-changing, but there is a way out and there is a way to have a brighter future.
And what I tell them is that trauma is often like an infection. We're going to get in there, we're going to clean out that infection by talking about it and work on healing that. It's a painful process. It's like pouring alcohol into an open wound sometimes. It's raw, it's tender. We get that all cleaned out by talking, by processing it, and it will heal. There's still a scar there. There will always be a scar there. They'll always know, but it won't be so tender every time, something bumps up against it, They won't be triggered so easily by other things, At some point, it won't hurt as much as it does right now. So I just tell them, stick through the process. We will get to the other side.
There are many resources available to people who have experienced trauma and are trying to deal with the aftermath.
When it comes to outreach of people with PTSD or trauma in general, mental health is incredibly important. And when I say mental health, I don't just mean psychiatry or medication. Talk therapy and things like EMDR, cognitive processing therapy, cognitive behavioral therapy, any of those things connected to working with a counselor is incredibly imperative for a client to begin to work through those traumatic memories.
It kind of depends on the situation. Some of the best resources, I think, would be one, to look at American Psychological Association. They have a variety of different research-related articles and resources online.
A lot of resources that people aren't always aware of, maybe if their families and their kids have been through trauma, or the family's been through trauma. There's a lot of child and family guidance centers in different areas across like DFW, and they provide either no-cost or low-cost services. There's also quite a few programs that different clinics have that offer a certain amount of free sessions for families who've been through a traumatic incident, or families who had a kid that's suicidal or had something more significant go on.
I'm hopeful that as more and more people seek therapy, and that the stigma around therapy dissipates over time, that we will see more and more people access mental health care just like they would go to their primary care physician if they had the flu or, and some kind of infection, right? We don't hesitate to go to the doctor when we're sick, but there's something about saying, I really need to go talk about this with somebody and get this off my chest, clean this out.
Education absolutely needs to be a part of that. A lot of times people don't know what resources there are out there for them. There are low-cost mental health treatment facilities. There are a lot of insurance will cover seeing a counselor, and a lot of people don't realize that their insurance will cover something like that. So education on what traumatic symptoms look like, and being aware that there are low-cost options out there if insurance isn't an option or if money is an issue. There are a whole lot of different resources out there that people just aren't aware of, so education is really, really imperative. And then, of course, making resources more accessible, making sure that people have access to mental health, making sure that, we try to reduce the stigma around what counseling is and who needs counseling. All of that is really, really important for getting people the help that they need, especially when it comes to trauma.
As a society overall, there are countless ways that we can help those who have experienced psychological trauma.
We all have been traumatized in some way or another. All of us carry some kind of trauma with us. We need to be more compassionate to each other. We need to operate as if, people are hurting all the time. We need to operate as if people are hurting, and we could be kinder.